Good evening. My name is David Cole, and I'm the president of the Science History Institute. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Institute's Spring 2021 Fellow in Focus program. This year's program is dedicated to the memory of the late June Felly, whose constant and selfless support of the Fellow in Focus program continued into her 95th year. This evening's lecture by our speaker, Bruce Moran, also doubles as the keynote address for the Institute's Applied Arts of Alchemy Symposium, which will be held tomorrow and Friday, and will explore alchemy's practical and applied uses and its lasting impact on chemistry, technology, medicine, experimentation, and the marketplace. Following this evening's lecture, I hope you'll join us for an action-packed happy hour hosted by our Distillations podcast team. Happy Hour will feature presentations by Kane Dissertation Fellow Megan Allen and Allington Postdoctoral Fellow Megan Piorko. There will also be a show and tell of distillation content drawn from our rare books collections, as well as a demonstration of how rosewater and other distillates can be produced at home. In fact, you'll see how you can incorporate rosewater into an alchemist-approved cocktail that you can enjoy at home this evening. So, without further ado, thank you again for coming, and I will turn things over to my colleague, Michelle DeMeo, Director of the Institute's Othmer Library, who will introduce our speaker. Michelle?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, David. My name is Michelle DeMeo, Director of the Othmer Library at the Science History Institute, and I am absolutely pleased to be hosting the first half of tonight's event. We will be introducing Bruce Moran, University Foundation Professor of History, Emeritus at the University of Nevada, Reno. He is currently editor of the peer-reviewed journal Ambix, published by the Society for the History of Alchemy and Chemistry. Professor Moran is a cultural historian with a general interest in the history of science and medicine. He has published many books and journals and articles on the history of alchemy, including Distilling Knowledge, Alchemy, Chemistry, and the Scientific Revolution, and Paracelsus, An Alchemical Life. He's also co-editor of the forthcoming Cultural History of Chemistry in the Early Modern Age. Now, Professor Moran has the honor of being the first former Beckman Center Fellow to be invited back to give a second Raman Haas Fellow in Focus lecture. Local attendees in Philadelphia area may remember that Professor Moran spoke to us in 2014 with a lecture on alchemy, murder, and marketing in early modern Europe. Today's talk will be a slightly lighter note. He'll be speaking, his talk is entitled The Thing About Alchemy: Secrets, Mixtures, and Discerning the Alchemical in the Potter's Art. Now, throughout the talk today, feel free to use the comments feature. We will have a little bit of time with Professor Moran to have a Q&A afterwards, but there's no need to hold your comments till the end. You can put them through the chat throughout this. And with that, I will now hand this over to Bruce Moran.
Just a little ironic. Well, I've chosen this title, The Thing About Alchemy, to be just a little ironic because what I want to do is to think about alchemy less as a specific thing or noun and more as an adjective or adverb. And I want to do that because we can then give attention to alchemical processes and note material objects prepared alchemically, but we don't have to concentrate in any conceptual way on the essential characteristics of that shape-shifting, morphing thing called alchemy. That doesn't mean that there aren't things to talk about, but critically, the kind of thing considered alchemical can, in this way, get broadened quite a bit and include something that might otherwise get ignored, and that is a relationship, one that connects material culture on the one hand and social life on the other, in a process of determining what counts as alchemical, or what may, well, perhaps be perceived as alchemical in objects made by art. By the way, most writers during the late Renaissance would have been completely at ease with separating alchemy from the alchemical. And many made distinctions between alchemical practices themselves, describing some of them as useful, some of them as unrewarding or even false. That's why observers can both love and loathe alchemical pursuits more or less simultaneously. The remarkable 16th century text concerning the arts of the fire by Vannocchio Berenguccio is a good example. Chrysopoeia, gold making, he says, does not exist and has never been seen by anybody. It was such a vain wish, a fanciful dream, that he had to restrain himself in its condemnation, although he says he could press forward with a throng of arguments like dogs happy in the chase in denouncing it. On the other hand, Berenguccio also observes that those who work alchemically are very skillful in producing and doing certain things. Sublimation is one of those things. Some can make glassware, and others can make vessels airtight and resistant to heat with a special clay called lutum sapientiae. They also make instruments for distillation, especially for slow distillation, and they make furnaces, in particular a reverberatory furnace or a wind furnace for melting, and a multiple furnace that they use for doing several tasks at once, like sublimating, while at the same time making waters and oils. In this case, he says, the alchemical art is a fine occupation, since in addition to being very useful to human need and convenience, it gives birth every day to new and splendid effects, such as the extraction of medicinal substances, colors, and perfumes, and an infinite number of compositions of things. Moreover, he adds, and I think most significantly, many arts have issued solely from it that otherwise could only have been discovered through divine revelation. That notion that alchemy gives birth to other arts becomes a leitmotif of later alchemical writing. In the first years of the 17th century, the German translation of a text written by Giovanni Battista Birelli, called in the German version Alchemia Nova, referred to alchemy as the mother of arts and alluded to its innumerable hidden children. Birelli's original Italian text, dedicated to Cosimo II de' Medici, made the same point in a slightly different way, emphasizing alchemy's useful, curious, and delightful members, and noting in its dedication Cosimo's role in protecting those alchemical arts and their practitioners for the good of all humankind. Well, this brings us back to the question of just how something might get recognized as being something alchemical. Berenguccio and Birelli remind us that an alchemical thing could be an object, an art, or a process. But if we want to ask about how artifacts themselves may actually get specified as alchemical things, how, in more general terms, some sort of object becomes some sort of a specific and desirable thing, then recent discussions in cultural history concerning the social reputations of objects, their prominence in social life, in other words, can offer some help. In this discussion, things are regarded as objects with a difference. The difference is the changed relation to the human subject. Objects become things when people have feelings about them and invest them with meaning. Things, in other words, assert themselves, gain agency, and become desirable within cultural contexts. So alchemical things, as things, to use Birelli's terms, that are useful, curious, and delightful, exist not only because of the processes that make them, but also as a result of how they are encountered, that is, how they are discerned or valued. And in the 15th century, that encounter between people and desired things gets described in a new way by an Italian humanist poet named Giovanni Pantano in a little text called On Splendor. What Pantano did, by means of a kind of humanist spagyria, was to separate the notion of splendor from the idea of magnificence. The result was a cultural extraction of a certain style of living, one in which the display of well-chosen objects within the aristocratic or elite household displayed as well the refinement and critical discernment of the patron and collector. Objects of splendor, when collected not only for their material value, but also for their perceived rarity or the exceptional, peculiar, or secretive qualities exhibited in their craftsmanship, became what have been called objects of virtue. In some instances, among the gems, portraits, and medals brought together for the ornament of the aristocratic household, there were other sorts of objects, vases, plates, glassware, imitation porcelain, that also bore value by way of expressing secretive techniques evoking alchemical agency. So in treating the relationship between alchemy and the applied arts, the task is to discuss, on the one hand, the alchemical processes involved in making certain objects, and on the other, the intellectual awareness that allowed for discerning certain objects as alchemical things. Both process and discernment come together in the applied arts, and both are, I think, quite nicely depicted here in Giovanni Maria Butteri's painting of the Medici Glass Workshop. Well, here you see in more detail that the furnace is all fired up, and there is plenty of process going on. And then there is the discerning figure, in this case, Francesco de' Medici, a patron, collector, and practitioner all at once of various sorts of alchemical arts. So just to be clear, the task is to engage alchemical things as in part alchemical judgment. And the way that I've chosen to do that is to focus on one of the most basic forms of material culture, namely pottery, and the making, evaluation, and collecting of what is called maiolica, and a more specific kind of maiolica called luster in the late Renaissance. Biringuccio noted that the art of the potter had two sources. One, he says, comes from the art of design, the other from various alchemical secrets and mixtures. Secrets related to the construction of furnaces and controlling temperatures. Mixtures pertain to the preparation of clays, glazes, lusters, and pigments. What made these mixtures alchemical was sometimes a secret in itself, but no matter what the recipe, they all shared something quite basic in common. And we can get a sense of what that was by looking briefly at a treatise called Il Libro dell'Arte by the Renaissance Italian painter Cennino Cennini. When it came to discussing colors, Cennini described vermilion, red lead, orpiment, verdigris, white lead, and a rarely used yellow called arzica as all being made alchemically. However, the color called small or pale yellow, giallorino, he says, although made artificially, is not alchemically produced. Giallorino, according to Cennini, was half natural and half artificial, derived from a stone found in nature, especially in volcanic places. Making it just required some grinding and mixing with water. You didn't, in other words, need to make something that was not originally there. If you did that, especially if you produced changes by means of plentiful heat and by way of processes like distillation and sublimation, you were working alchemically. That's why vermilion was an alchemical process. It also required water and grinding, but then, Cennini says, you need a retort. Barbara Berry has noted how painters in the 16th century learned about some colors like deep yellow and reddish orange, made from arsenical sulfides like orpiment and realgar, by way of glassmaking and pottery decoration. When potters referred to gelorino, however, they were not referring to a pale yellow pigment, but to a yellowish glaze, one made from mixing lead and antimony. But they also made a whiter glaze by mixing lead and tin. Sometimes they mixed all three, lead, tin, and antimony. Biringuccio knew that pewterers mixed tin with lead because it was easier to hammer, and he says more fluid in casting, but he actually didn't have much use for the alloy itself, and viewed it as good for only two things, really. It was a cheap way to avoid using silver when soldering copper vessels. But its other use was, he says, when master potters calcine it in order to make glazes and to apply white to their vases. The reference to a white glaze, or bianco, was a reference to a kind of pottery glaze that has come to be referred to as maiolica, a mixture usually of lead, tin, and alkali. And making maiolica, and a more elaborate form of glazing called luster, brought numerous parts of working alchemically to bear upon what is itself one of the most fundamental synthetic creations of the applied arts, namely ceramics. Potters had been using variations of the glaze for a long time before its preparation received a detailed description in a manuscript called 3 Books of the Potter's Art, written in the mid-16th century by an Italian courtier and Umbrian official named Cipriano Piccolpasso. The text contained quite a few illustrations, and by means of images and text, Piccolpasso intended to disclose the secrets of the potter, what Biringuccio and others would have called alchemical secrets. Some he knew would say that he was wrong to publish what had been concealed for so many years, and others would say he hadn't gone far enough. He wasn't a potter, but he understood what potters did. Pottery making was practiced in the family, and it was better, he claimed, that many should know a good thing than that a few should keep it hidden. The most important secret in making the opaque glaze bianco was the process of preparing its most important constituent, a calcined mixture called marzicato. Marzicato lowered the melting temperature of the glaze and involved a procedure most likely learned from those who knew how to make glass. To make marzicato, you needed sand and wine lees, the chunky sediment at the bottom of wine barrels. And Piccolpasso's drawing shows how, once the wine was pressed out of the lees were dried, collected into loaves, and carried out of town to be burned and reduced to a white ash. And this, says Piccolpasso, to a distance of about a mile, because the bad smell they make, many say, is apt to make pregnant women miscarry. The ash was the source of alkali, and after it was mixed with sand and fired, the marzicato was ground up, mixed with tin, actually a mixture of lead and tin metals, sometimes scrap pewter, and then refired to produce a calx that produced the glaze itself, a tin lead alkali glaze that appeared especially white. No matter what the precise recipe, bianco was a thick matte glaze to which a new sort of color, less soluble than earlier colors, could be applied, and that could sink into the glaze without spreading. When the pot was fired a second time, the colors fused with the bianco and remained essentially unchanged thereafter. Some potters, before the second firing, applied a second clear glaze, or coperta, another lead oxide and alkali mixture, over the painted surface. And this made colors even more luminous and gave the surface a nice, glossy, smooth cover. And this is what you see usually in the painted narrative scenes made famous by Francesco Zantoavelli and others, known as istoriato. Maiolica, like other borderline labels, including chemia and alchemia, is a term best understood in context. For Pico Passo, it referred to a specific kind of glazing process called lustering, and lustering, in a most pronounced way, produced wares perceived as even more dramatic expressions of alchemical secrets. Lustering results in a shiny metallic surface that can look very much like gold. The first recorded Italian instructions for making luster occur in the 15th century in a treatise, actually a collection of recipes related to glassmaking and other arts attributed to Benedetto Ubriachi. In a nutshell, a metallic luster is produced by applying pigments consisting of compounds of silver and copper mixed with a medium of clay or ochre to areas usually left intentionally unpainted on the surface of an already fired glaze. With a third firing in a special kiln that allows very little air to get in, and by burning smoke-producing woods that starve the air of oxygen, the silver and metallic compounds in the pigment convert to a more or less pure metallic state and are deposited as a thin metallic film on the surface of a softened glaze. If the temperature has been judged just right, the clay or ochre can be rubbed away when the objects cool down, and the areas where luster was applied appear with a metallic sheen. When copper is used, the surface takes on a reddish luster. Silver produces a luster on the yellowish side. By controlling the heat and with proper mixture, Pico Passo writes, when the work comes out well, it seems like gold. And this without any gold gilding, which was done before, where gold leaf is applied to ceramics, but this is gold without the use of gold. Almost all the luster made before 1800 results from this process called today reduced pigment lustering. The interesting thing about the process is that, as with a lot of other processes, it is easier to describe than to do and requires a kind of technical knowledge that would have been very difficult to acquire by chance or by simply imitating imported artifacts. Someone, an adept, would have to show you the secrets involved in producing luster. And then you would have to refine practice by making lots of mistakes. Pico Passo says that out of 100 pieces fired with luster, scarcely 6 come out good. That's probably why only a few places pursued the technique. Lusterware was rare, a luxury item, made with secretive techniques, and only 2 places in Italy were ultimately left standing as lusterware centers. These were De Ruta and Gubbio. The history of lusterware in Gubbio usually gets discussed in connection with the workshop of a master craftsman named Giorgio Andreoli. We know that painters from Casteldurante, today's Urbania, including Zanto Avelli, traveled to Gubbio to work for him. And there is some evidence that certain plates were taken to Gubbio after being painted and fired twice in Urbino to have luster added in Giorgio's workshop. When Pico Passo described the process, he had to admit that he had never attempted the technique, nor had he ever seen it done. What he knew of it, he says, he had come by at Gubbio, in the house of one Maestro Cenzio of that place. This is Vincenzo Andreoli, the son of Maestro Giorgio, and what Pico Passo would have seen in his workshop, and what the workshop was famous for, was a brilliant ruby red luster made by mixing red earth, Armenian bole, ferretto of Spain, that's been identified as copper sulfide, and cinnabar or vermilion. At Gubbio, Pico Passo would also have seen the kiln used for firing luster, and this is probably the source for the drawing of a reduction kiln in his treatise. The way it was actually built was a secret, and he notes some built it on the floors of houses which are locked and under close guard, for they look on the matter of making it as an important secret and say that in this consists the whole art. What he knew of the secret, he nevertheless attempted to describe, he says, without disguise, by putting it down in an image. Henceforth, by looking at the image, he says, I assume that I am understood. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Illustrations may have helped to convey an image of the kiln, but words had to suffice in the description of the luster process. For the fuel, he says, the choice should be straw or else willow branches, well dried and free from damp. Well, that's very nice, but he doesn't tell us why. The reason why is that moisture tends to dissolve some of the soluble metallic compounds in the luster pigment, making dribbles and stains. Only the experience of someone who knew and practiced the technique could know that, however. And in order to convey something of actual experience, what I want to do at this point is to turn to the descriptions of lustering that are provided by a master British scholar potter named Alan Kager-Smith. Kager-Smith, who died just last year at the age of 90, was a master at lusterware. And in his commentary on the lustering process, he recognizes that controlling the temperature within the kiln was the true technical secret. It required more Fingerspitzengefühl than adherence to any instruction or recipe. And this was because the temperature has to get gradually built up to a point capable of softening the glaze, and then has to be monitored to stay at that temperature for an hour or so. It's the softening of the glaze, as well as the reduction atmosphere of the kiln, that makes the metallic iridescent shine stick to the pot. Figuring out what the temperature softening point is becomes a matter of trial and error. And Kager-Smith discovered that glazes with a high alkali content work best. Those glazes, he found, soften at lower temperatures. And at lower temperatures, silver and copper are also less volatile. So the metal remains where the pigment was applied. The right temperature for this to happen, he tells us, is a temperature that can be recognized by the eye. It's when the chamber glows red. Once the chamber begins to glow, the fire is stoked more heavily to create as much smoke as possible. And this is not a tidy process. Smoke comes out of every crack and spy hole in the kiln, says Kager-Smith, and soot gets on everything. After a few minutes, the fire becomes clear again, and the temperature begins to rise. So the fire is stoked once again, and once again the chamber becomes smoky, and the process is repeated until sample pieces removed from the kiln begin to change color. Silver pigments, Kager-Smith reports, first become greenish brown, then silvery brown, then later dark bluish silver. Copper pigments progress from yellow through amber brown and orange to pink, gold, red gold, and then to ruby. Any one of those colors might be desired, and getting it depends on managing time, heat, and on regulating the smoky atmosphere in the kiln that pulls oxygen out of the clay and glaze. Well, enough about alchemical process for the moment. What about the recognition of alchemical agency on the part of consumers, collectors, or patrons of maiolica and luster? Here, I think what counts is the impression of value demonstrated by a kind of craftsmanship not generally practiced, yet in which the presence of secrets, peculiar hidden qualities, and rare mixtures might be discerned or at least assumed. Recognizing and valuing the hidden in art as well as in nature was, of course, a major theme in Renaissance writing. Both Biringuccio and Pico Passo emphasized the need to seek out the occult virtues in every part of the world, even though it be an atom or the smallest worm, says Biringuccio, so as to discover things undreamt of, says Pico Passo. Bringing what was kept hidden by potters and undreamt of by others to lofty spirits and speculative minds was part of Pico Passo's intent in writing his text. And for the location of such lofty occult and alchemical discernment, he had a particular site in view. When what had been hidden in the potter's art was made pertinent to discriminating taste, then the secrets of the art would, he says, circulate in courts. Alchemical secrets displayed as technique altered the collecting habits of aristocratic and urban elites. Pantano took note of the change, observing that there are some who prefer the tiniest little vase of that which they call porcelain to vases of silver and gold. Chinese porcelain had found its way by land and sea, first to the Middle East and then to Europe, hundreds of years earlier. And by the 16th century, millions of pieces of porcelain had already been transported. Porcelain, collected for its rarity, translucency, hardness, and shape, was certainly desirable. But if you like colors, especially the vivid greens, yellows, reds, and oranges incorporated into the pictorial conventions of istoriato, maiolica, and luster was what you wanted. And even apart from colors, a special kind of maiolica, in imitation of porcelain, became an expression of splendor and discernment. From the point of view of elite taste, it was no small matter that istoriato, luster, and imitation porcelain not only appear, but were sometimes manufactured within courtly circles. In his 3 books of the potter's art, Pico Passo noted Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, who experimented in the art of pottery at a special kiln built for himself and gave him credit for creating a particular white glaze, bianco sopra bianco, white on top of white. In this case, a lustrous white had illustrious origins, and Pico Passo emphasized the suitability of its courtly pedigree, remarking that the Duke's experiments will not diminish the greatness and worth of so excellent a prince, nor will it obscure the whiteness or the brightness of his white. To his sister Isabella d'Este, Alfonso sent a present of pottery composed and made in our private apartments. For her part, Isabella, the Marchioness of Mantua, brought the collecting tastes of the d'Este to the Gonzaga court, and along with antiquities and paintings, personally sought out and collected maiolica as a means to display the refinement, taste, and learning that she personally cultivated. Nicola da Urbino, one of the first and most successful istoriato painters, produced for Isabella one such service, which currently survives in 23 individual pieces. The designs, many derived from woodcuts, illustrated scenes from nearly every book of Ovid's Metamorphoses, and were probably on display in Isabella's studiolo or in her barrel-vaulted grotta set up in the Corte Vecchia apartments at the Ducal Palace. Isabella commissioned and collected maiolica and istoriato as a means of exhibiting refinement and humanist learning. Alfonso's productions illustrate that technique in the mechanical arts was becoming an object of study and imitation among the cultivated elite, including princes and noblemen. In pottery, techniques embraced what Biringuccio referred to as alchemical secrets and mixtures, and even among princes who had given up on chrysoproeia, there remained attraction to alchemical processes in producing what Birelli called useful, curious, and delightful things. Such a view fit nicely into the ancient and ongoing discussion about how art improved nature. Aristotle, Galen, and Cicero had early taken part in that discussion, and in the Renaissance, it received new impetus from Giambattista della Porta and alchemical writers like the humanist author and member of the Florentine Academy, Benedetto Varchi. It is nature's part to produce things, said della Porta, but art may ennoble them and give them many different qualities. Varchi, in his Questione sull'alchemia, 1544, referred to alchemia as alchemia. He is a humanist poet, replacing the L with an R made it more Greek, he said, and anyway, it just sounded better in Tuscan that way. What was important, whether or not it was called alchemia or alchemia, what was significant, well, was that it could be true or false. Princes needed to know the difference, he said, for the sake of the well-being of well-ordered republics. Aside from 1,000 tricks and wickedness, including the falsification of coins and making poisons, alchemia or alchemia was false when it promised not just to imitate nature, but to exceed and conquer it. True alchemia, he said, enabled nature and assisted especially medicine and agriculture. It was most useful, delightful, and virtuous as it pertained to the study and knowledge of metals, which brought great benefits to medicine, conveyed amenities to ingenious crafts, especially to painters, and provided tools for craftsmen. It made mortar, numerous sorts of vessels, as well as waters, oils, and liquors in the thousands, without which, he says, one could still live, but not with convenience or comfort. True alchemy, to use Varkey's terms, is what connected prince and layman in the applied arts, and it did so by means of applying secrets and mixtures to specific practices and instruments related to making useful and desirable things. It might look different on the street and at court, but its purpose was the same. On the street, around 1570, it looked like this. There's a title page from a very popular text with reference to the preparation of colors, waters, oils, salts, and alums, to dissolving and separating metals, burnishing precious stones, and making acids for etching, all part of alchemical labor. And here is how that same sort of alchemical reference to making things looks at court, also around 1570. These are images that decorated the studiolo of Francesco de' Medici at the Palazzo Vecchio, related to alchemical pursuits. Francesco's workshop is more illustrious, but the instruments depicted there are very similar to what one would have found in other locations. The distillation device with a worm condenser in the foreground is a good example. Biringuccio described it as a vessel of tinned copper, from which a long tube of several chambers extends, at the end of which is a little vat, and above this, a snake-like tube with a glass hood on top. He added that, for distillation, it was the best of all that I have seen. The instruments in the two images are, by and large, identical. The difference is where they were located. For his vessels, Francesco built a small building called the Casino de San Marco that was designed by Bernardo Buontalenti. It was here that he set up his court foundries and workshops, bringing craftsmanship, materiality, and alchemical practice together to demonstrate Medici power. Buontalenti supervised the workshops and their artisans, and the art of the potter was well represented there. Of 18 names recorded, Marco Beretta notes that 3 were salaried for activities relating to making maiolica, or imitating Chinese porcelain. What became known as Medici porcelain was a white clay that contained essentially 3 ingredients: feldspar, the source of calcium and potassium oxides, calcium phosphate, and calcined bone and quartz. Like objects of maiolica and luster, making Medici porcelain involved applying alchemical secrets and mixtures in making desirable things. But the process of becoming socially specified as alchemical things required something more. Whatever was made by means of instruments and alembics in the workshop needed also to pass through another sort of alchemical vessel, what the American philosopher John Dewey called the alembic of personal experience, the way that the subjective finished the process of the maker's intention and design. I really like that reference of Dewey's, because what it implies is that objects of art get brought to life and become valued things as a result of being animated by people. That strikes me as enormously important for our discussion, because in thinking about alchemy and the applied arts, we really get forced to think about how the material and the social interact, about how alchemical techniques produce social effects, about the ways in which secrets and mixtures create objects that claim alchemical attention. When the materiality of maiolica and luster passed through this alembic of personal experience, techniques related to producing physical change intersected with social values related to the discernment of secrecy, rarity, and craftsmanship. That relationship, where the social and the material meet, is the real thing about alchemy in its relation to the applied arts. It is that part of the alchemical experience that results from making and valuing useful, curious, and delightful objects, and doing so by way of both applying as well as discerning alchemical secrets and mixtures in the early modern world.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That was a fantastic talk.
I hate hearing myself speak. It's horrible. It really is. Incidentally, I noticed something didn't get corrected. I tried to correct it. Apparently, it didn't get corrected. It's Alan Catersmith, not Vagersmith, as it was on the slide. Aside from that, 3 cheers for Alexis.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us for the Q&A, Bruce. We'll take a few questions from the audience right now. Your first one has come in is where can I read more about the control of heat in alchemical labs and the potter's art?
Oh my. Well, I suppose, well, let me think. Where can I learn about the control of heat in a historical context?
Right.
Is
Yes.
that the idea? Well, I'm going to have to think about that. I don't really have a quick answer for someone who wants to know specifically that. You know, these are secrets in many respects. I mean, they're in a way secrets and they're not secrets. They
Looks like Bruce froze for me.
There
Oh,
we go.
you're back. You're talking about secrets.
Much of what he described was fairly well known, but among potters and not among those who purchase pottery, not among consumers by any means. The type of trial and error, I would say, that relates to knowing what to do when is sometimes kept fairly close within a certain community. A good experience or a good example of that is one of the pottery centers in Italy close to Florence, namely Montelupo. There, the potters of Montelupo have been studied from, down to very specific families over hundreds of years. But what is really interesting about the place is that in the early 1970s, there was a discovery made. One well and then another well, as a result of some digging going on in the neighborhood, began to reveal bits and pieces of pottery that pretty much chronicled years of failure. So the museum in Montelupo, the ceramics museum in Montelupo, is on the one hand a celebration of the potter's art in that town, but it's also, because of those discoveries, a very good place to learn about what has worked, what didn't, the potters in Montelupo were just not good at lustering at all, so down the well it went. Sometimes as color changes in the kiln, you can get a sense of what the temperature is. And in fact, in Pico Passo's text, there's a very famous illustration. I didn't include it. But if the questioner wants to look at that treatise, that would be a really interesting place to begin, because it describes, the image is of an elderly man sitting on a stool looking up through a spy hole in a kiln and just observing what would have been color changes in the kiln. The only additional instrument is an hourglass, some way to measure time. And you have references in that illustration to individuals bringing wood from a storehouse. But you get a sense that this took a while, because there's also in the background what appears to be a woman bringing lunch. So you're going to be at this for a while. You're going to be observing these color changes. You're going to be looking very specifically and remembering your own experience. Sometimes you just have to take out an inserted bit of pot to see what has happened to it along the way. So these temperature changes, when you read about, in the secondary literature, you read about these things and, oh, it's very precise. Yes, earthenware, you need about 600 to, no more than 1,000 degrees centigrade, or things really bad happen in the kiln. For stoneware, now we're talking about vitrification. Oh, maybe 1,000 degrees to 1,200. Oh my goodness, and for porcelain now, 1,300 and above sometimes, depending on clay. But all of that is gained through experience. And as a result, in the Renaissance period, no one is using a thermometer. There are no kilns that will tell you how hot things have gotten. All you know really is what you see in the experience you've had. And individuals have very, very specific occupations in the workshop. Some are there only to make sagers to hold the pots while they get cooked in the kiln. Some are there only to arrange the kiln. Some are there only to work on clay. Women are there usually to put handles on things. Don't know how that happened, but there you go. Some are there to paint. Some are there to make glazes, all specific occupations. So aside from the secondary literature, I think one would have to go back to Pico Passo, see what one can find there, and then look at descriptions. Once industrial pottery begins, when you have a different sort of kiln to use, then you can look and see more about what temperatures might be involved.
Thank you, Bruce. There were some follow-up questions here, and it seems like you answered those. Did they have an accurate way of measuring temperature? Probably not was a question, and you talked about experience and what was in there, so I think you answered that one. And then a follow-up question about how do we know what we know about furnaces, how they were built and controlled, but I think you answered that as well, unless you want to add to that.
I can say a little bit more about that because it's actually really interesting. And there you do have a good deal of descriptive information, but also you have archaeological information. So you can actually find these kilns. There's a reverberatory furnace, which is basically a vaulted chamber with a little half wall that would separate the firebox from the place where the ceramics are being fired. The soot and the flames would go up over the wall and then out through a chimney. Sometimes these are built up in layers, so you get 2 and 3 different levels. And the 3-level one is very interesting because where the soot and fire go is right underneath the vault. And that's where you would put in the clay that's hard but ready to be made into a biscuit. It doesn't matter if they get all sooty and look terrible when they come out, because they're going to be painted and glazed after that. So you stick those up on the top, and then you can use the lower parts for your glazing. Muffle kilns are also well known. So through archaeological sites, we can really rebuild these kilns and learn a lot about them. And that's another avenue of inspecting the whole process.
Absolutely. Bruce, could you reflect a bit about some of your diverse methodologies? Because I've heard you talk about textual methods, archaeological works, art history, looking at the objects. Have you tried reconstruction as well? I'm just wondering if you could talk about, since we're talking about secrets, right? The challenges of finding this missing information that was held secret in the first place. If you could talk about your methods as a historian.
Well, and this is very important, and lots of people are doing that, of course. At this stage, I'm doing more reading than doing, I must say. And now in my retired years, perhaps I'll have time to actually go about it in another manner. My sense is, however, that wherever there is the experience with a material thing, there's also a sense of value that is related to it, either in terms of producing something slightly different that has commercial advantage, producing something that is appealing from a perspective of artistic quality and as I say, discernment. So I like to really blend the social with the material in that regard. And, doing that really leads to some very interesting questions that relate to gender. Isabella d'Este is a really interesting case. I mean, she must have been some shrewd woman. I mean, she has to walk this knife edge when she's married to Francesco Gonzaga. She must appear not to be learned, but she is. And she must appear not to have studied anything in order to be learned. It has to be almost intrinsic. It has to be kind of inherited. For Isabella, what she does is to get control of the court household. When she does, she's able to hire fewer people, save money on salaries, use that money to buy land, get the rents from land to then buy things, art, sculpture, antiquities, maiolica. And when she begins to put together her pieces, she does so not in a public space, but in a private space. So opening up the questions of private and public as it relates to collecting and valuing and discerning, I think is really very important, because we are walking constantly these two sides, both the side that has to do with learning about how things were done, but also we have to ask ourselves, well, why do them in the first place? What is it that we're trying to achieve or by doing these things? When potters, make istoriato, they're very concerned with sort of lowering the viscosity of certain glazes, so that the pores get filled in the pot itself. You get a nice smooth kind of surface as a result. And so there's this sense of kind of blending lead oxide and alkali, getting, the more you get, the lower the viscosity. And so that has to be learned through a lot of trial and error. The painters are involved in this, following woodcuts, but also, Pico Paso says, the brushes sometimes are made out of mice whiskers to do really fine work. So that materiality and the point of doing it, I think, are really important to bear in mind in the applied art. So yeah, I'm pretty much focused on texts right now. And to the extent that they do reveal some sort of process or experiential understanding, I basically soak it up. Maybe at a point I'll be better at doing than just reading about. But right now, I'm just trying to get as much behind me as I can before I do any of that. Although I did throw a pot once. once.
Nice. I've thrown pots too, but never done any alchemical glazing of them. We have quite a few questions, Bruce, but we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask you just a couple right now, and then if you want afterwards, you can jump on and answer some of the others in the comment thread, or we can send you those and help you out with the answers. But I'll jump into Lisa Cooper, following up from these textual questions, is saying, I'm wondering if the early modern pottery manuals have explicit things to say about the elevation of earth clay via the potter's art, including via the application of luster.
Well, of course, the clays are where it all begins, and depending where you are, if I understand the question correctly, depending where you are, you end up with a iron-rich red clay, or you can mix clay. I mean, that is a process in itself in which you try to get rid of the little twigs and bits of shell, depending if you've got the clay out of riverbeds or out of quarries. There are all kinds of things that can get in there, and they'll create space. Then the pot will just have holes and cracks if you don't get rid of them. So depending upon where you get the clay, but makes a difference in what then you're able to do. But the process is by and large the same. It is by a process of filtration through troughs, usually 4 of them, pressing out the bigger bits, and then ultimately squeezing out the gases, either stomping on them or kneading them, and then throwing them. You get a sense at one point where what gets described in Pico Paso, they're called pagliacci, I think. The clown, you make a clown. It probably comes from brick making, where it's straw and clay, and it gets thrown against a wall and sticks there, and then sort of dries out a little bit, but in the shade, not too fast. So the processes are pretty well known. The clays are various, and depending upon where they come from, quarried or riverbeds, depending what's in them, what needs to be removed. All of that really does matter in terms of what kinds of ceramics are you're able to create, and what you're able then to do with them. Because, some of this requires numerous firings. What I found is that there's a lot of, I don't know if it's confusion or just resistance, but there are, the uses of terms are various among people who describe the ceramic process. And one of the interesting bits is, what's the difference between a glaze and an enamel? Well, all of this has his historical contextual meaning attached to it. Pico Paso thought maiolica was really luster, what we would call luster. And in doing all of that, I mean, we do just find that enameling, for instance, where you get a kind of pigment mixed with a kind of metallic flux, that requires a 3rd firing as well, sometimes even more, depending upon the color you want to preserve, since these colors don't stick well unless they're at certain temperatures. All of that has got to be really thought through. All of that, I think, has got historical contextual realities attached. And it just won't do to just make blanket statements without contextualizing this, as well as just about everything else that has to do with alchemy, in my opinion.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Bruce. So there are a few other questions. We are at time though, so I think what we'll do afterwards is I can help you respond to them on the chat. And we, of course, those of us who are historians and are attending the Applied Arts of Alchemy conference will be with you on Zoom over the next couple of days, and we can continue some of these conversations then. But I wanted to thank you very much, Bruce, for this very entertaining and engaging talk tonight. I always love hearing you speak. You're such a engaging speaker. I think you froze, but hopefully he can hear me. There you are. Okay. And so now with this, it's my turn to turn this over to the second half of the program for tonight. It is time for the Distillations Happy Hour, which is hosted by the Distillations podcast hosts, Lisa Berry-Drago and Alexis Pedrick. So on Distillations, Lisa and Alexis explore funny, bizarre, and serious stories from the intersection of science, culture, and history. They are coming up next, but you can also check them out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or anywhere you get your podcasts. And while you're at it, you can also listen to their second podcast, The Disappearing Spoon, a topsy-turvy, science-y history podcast from New York Times bestselling author Sam Keane. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Lisa and Alexis.
Hello.
Hi, everybody. I was just doing a little grooving.
Yeah, there was a dance. There was a dance going on. So, hi, all. I'm Alexis Pedrick.
I'm Lisa Berry Drago, and we are Distillations.
We could have. I think we should have come up with a different title for this, like distilled with distillations. I think I like that. Maybe
the Fellow in Focus after party.
I do. I like that. I like that too. I think that also works. So it seemed fitting for us tonight to explore our namesake, the art of distillation. And we've got two guests to help us out this evening. First up is, why don't you take a Meg and I'll take a Megan.
I'll take a Meg. You take a Megan. That's perfect.
Okay, I love it.
Well, both of our Meg and Megans tonight are with us from the Science History Institute from the Beckman Center here, and so Meg Piorco is a 2020 to 2022 Allington postdoctoral fellow right here at the Beckman Center at Science History Institute. So she's working with us in a lot of different capacities and a lot of different projects. Her work is really cool. Her research focuses on the ways in which material interventions in hand-pressed texts can create new knowledge with 17th century alchemical texts. So really the material side of the alchemical text, which I think we often focus on, what's written in the text. And Meg is focusing on, how they're constructed and what that means, which I think is really powerful and cool.
Yes. So our other Megan Allen, this is very exciting because we're alchemy nerds here. So this is like our dream year. She's the 2020-2021 Kane Dissertation Fellow at the Science History Institute and a doctoral candidate in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science and Medicine at Indiana University. That's where she's completing her PhD. Her dissertation, Roger Bacon's Medical Alchemy, Medieval Pharmacology, and the
Prolongatio?
Yes.
Prolongatio.
Yes.
Virtual high five, Alexis.
Yay! On the podcast, this all gets edited out, and then you guys just hear me say it perfectly. So it examines Roger Bacon's alchemical theories and their application to 13th century medical practice. So tonight, we're going to kind of look at distillation from a couple different angles. Megan is going to give us a short history of the art of distillations and its applications to alchemy. She's also going to demonstrate how rosewater and other distillates, but I think just rosewater for the purposes of this evening, can be produced at home. And we hope you followed the recipe we sent you when you registered for the event and that you purchased some rosewater because we are going to, there we go. We're going to toast with our alchemist-approved cocktails. So that'll be the first half of our happy hour.
And once we've got our beverages and we have learned all about distillation, I mean, top to bottom, front to back, we will be distillation experts. When that's all set, we're headed to the library. And to be honest, this is the closest we can get to the library with this in our hand.
Yes.
Don't worry, Michelle.
It's a virtual library.
But you will get to sit back and enjoy Meg Piorco's show and tell of rare books from the Othmer Library that contain references to alchemical distillation. She's going to explain for us how 17th century readers used and reused texts in order to work through practical alchemy. So revealing all that visual evidence that they left behind.
But first, I think we should have that demonstration, and I think we should roll that footage. So here we go. Roll the footage. There we go. So now we've done this. Of course, we made this by hand in the background while this video was playing. And now I think we probably should have an official toast. Correct? There we go.
Cheers to that.
Who should we toast to?
Can we toast to Paracelsus?
Yes. Yes.
See, I'm a big fan of toasting to Paracelsus because, of course, as we all know, Paracelsus says the dose makes the poison. So a little bit of alcohol is actually medicine.
Yes. This is, you know what?
You heard it here first. That's just 16th century science.
Exactly. Toast.
Cheers.
Cheers. I think Paracelsus would be thrilled, honestly. So I think we should bring Megan back on. And I think that she should tell us a little bit about what was going on behind the scenes, because we used a lot of movie magic to do it really quickly. And I think she can tell us a little bit more about what happened. So let's see. Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Welcome. So, as I just told the audience, we used a little bit of movie magic to make our rosewater distillation really, really quickly. But I was hoping you would come and tell us a little bit more about it and kind of give us a behind the scenes look.
Yeah, I want to say thank you for the editing to that video. You guys did a great job making the video, and I think the music really livens it up.
It was the right vibe, I think.
Yeah.
I like to imagine that this is how Alchemist did it.
Yeah,
There's always like a lute in the corner somewhere, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Yeah. So, well, yes. Thank you again for hosting and for letting me share a little bit about distillation. So I have a couple slides, and I'd like to just give everyone a little brief introduction to the process of distillation, and then the history of distillation, and then we'll move on to Meg's portion. So
all right, yeah. That works. Okay, so you have slides. I do have the power. So whenever your slides are ready, you let me know, and I will add them. That's
all right. I am ready.
It's a very glamorous world here. Let's see. Okay,
I'm trying to do the magic.
I know. This is all right. So let's see. All right. So we'll see. Aha. Now we're talking.
Okay, are we all set?
Yeah,
we're all set.
Okay, so has the movie magic worked?
The movie magic has worked.
Okay, good. So yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed that video of the distillation process. I don't have a lab, so what I've done is sort of my best approximation of the distillation process in my kitchen, as you can tell. So I put a smaller pot inside of a larger pot on a stand, which you saw in the video. And instead of a condenser or a cooling tube with cold water, I've used an inverted pot lid and a bag of ice. And then I just used my stovetop as a heat source. So I didn't have any of the problems that were brought up at the end of Bruce Moran's talk, because I just set my temperature to medium on the stovetop and walked away. So as you can see, this didn't really involve any specialty equipment. And so if you're interested, you can try this at home. There's only two things that I would like to bring up. If you do make your own rosewater using this process, be sure to use roses that haven't been treated with pesticides. And the second point is that different varieties of roses have different scents and flavors. So yeah, your rosewater will be different. If you want that sort of stereotypical rose water, you should go with red or pink roses. And if any of you have, I mean, as you know, you all bought your rose water, I'm sure, wink, wink. Rose water can be quite expensive, so making your own, if you use a lot of it, is a good alternative. So a little bit about the process of distillation. For those of us who maybe don't remember Gen Chem as well as we should have, distillation is the process of separating or purifying the components of a mixture through evaporation and condensation. There are many types of distillation: dry, fractional, wet, etc. But today I'm only going to be talking about distilling liquids because that's what I showed you in the video. So keep that in mind. And the most basic form of distillation requires only 5 ingredients, which you can see on the screen here: a heat source, a vessel in which to heat the liquid mixture, a condenser, a receiving vessel for collecting the distillate, and of course the liquid that you are going to be distilling. Which all of this you saw in the video. A vessel containing the liquid mixture is placed on the heat source and the temperature raised until the liquid begins to evaporate. When the evaporated liquid hits the condenser, it reverts to a liquid state, and then it travels down the condenser into the receiving vessel. So different substances vaporize at different temperatures. So by carefully controlling the heat and temperature, you can successfully separate the components of a liquid mixture. And you'll notice that my setup is different, obviously, than what I show in this picture. And that's because I've done this a number of times, and it's very difficult to see in equipment with specialized equipment like this. Almost all of it is stainless steel. So there are many uses for distillation, and if you read tonight's program, or you watched the video, you know that I distilled rosewater. But distillation can also be used to desalinate water and make it safe for drinking, make liquors from fermented beverages, and even refine crude oil. Liquor is probably the one that most of us are familiar with. Liquors like brandy are made by distilling wine, and vodka is a distillate of fermented grains. And as a side note, if you're wondering why I am distilling rosewater instead of brandy, it's because the distillation of alcohol is illegal without a license in all 50 states, even if you are doing it for home use and not for sale. So in the case of rosewater, the steam, the more volatile components in the rose petals, which comprise the distillate, and less volatile compounds remain in the liquid. And what you end up with are the 2 liquids: the distillate, which is clear and has a slight rose scent and taste, and the heated water, which is basically just rose tea. It's steeped rose leaves. All right. And yeah, here you can see the process again. So here's the setup with the 2 pots, the funnel inverted, or a funnel made from an inverted lid, and then ice to speed up the process of condensation. So the process of distillation has been used for thousands of years, at least since the 2nd millennium BCE, and produced cosmetics, perfumes, potable water. The distillation of alcohol is not as clear. There's been a number of scholarly articles written that say that distillation of alcohol was pioneered in southern Italy in the 12th century, possibly at Salerno. Magister Salernus, who died in 1167, connects the beneficial waters created via the distillation of alcohol and later scholars have connected the relatively late invention of alcoholic distillation to the creation of Venetian glass, which is able to cool the distillate more effectively, and also the realization that adding salts to the solution absorbs additional water, increasing the concentration of ethanol in the distillate. However, alcoholic beverages can be distilled to produce liquor with low concentrations of ethanol without these innovations. So it's entirely possible that distillation of fermented beverages was practiced before the 12th century. By the end of the 13th and beginning of the 14th century, we have evidence of alcohol being distilled for medicinal purposes. The Florentine Dr. Taddeo Alderotti, who died in 1295, wrote about the virtues of aqua vitae, or distilled alcohol, in medicine. His work on the preparation and medicinal use of alcohol provides not only a summary of the benefits of aqua vitae, but also instructions for its preparation and administration. As you can see from this quote, this is a time and labor-intensive process, the best distilled aqua vitae requiring up to 10 cycles of distillation. And with each cycle of distillation, the ethanol content of the distillate becomes higher and higher, so you're getting a higher proof alcohol with each cycle. Alchemists in medieval Europe were well aware of the ability of distillation to separate a mixture's constituent components. In the Opus Tertium, written around 1267, Roger Bacon describes the keys of alchemy. One of these keys is distillation. Distillation and the related processes of resolution and sublimation, which involves vaporizing a solid mixture rather than a liquid, are important alchemical processes that can be used for making simple medicines. In his work on the errors of the doctors, likely written sometime in the 1280s, Bacon specifically mentions rosewater as an example of a medicine that can be made using these techniques. So here's a quote from his work. So I know we toasted Paracelsus at the beginning, but I think we should also, if you have any of your cocktail left, you should also toast Roger Bacon for suggesting that we have some rosewater. And of course, there is the famous Franciscan John of Rupescizza, whose book on the fifth essence contains numerous practical instructions on how to distill alcohol, not only on its own, but also by infusing it with organic and inorganic ingredients, including, of course, roses. Like Alderati, Rupescizza intends for these distillates to be used as medicines, preserving and protecting the bodies of the spiritual men. In the early modern period, distillation continues to be an important alchemical process and can be seen in works such as the 16th century 12 Keys of Basil Valentine. So I will wrap up here because Meg Piorco is going to talk more about the materiality of texts on the topic of distillation in her section, and she has lots of awesome pictures, so I think we should move on to that.
I like it. Thank you. Thank you. So first of all, I just want to say that in the chat, there are an alarming number of plans going on here about starting a seance so that we could toast Paracelsus. John Damien's
and
name
Roger
is also...
Bacon and everybody. Yeah.
So this is, I like that you all agree with us.
There's a lot of enthusiasm for drinking with dead alchemists around here.
Yes,
I like the energy.
I do. It feels like also a good time to plug our upcoming season. So the new season of Distillations is coming out in June, and we are going to be. It's a fantasy season, a storytelling season. We're telling stories of the history of science, and we're going to get into ghosts. So, if you're thinking about seances,
science and pseudoscience, and where those things collide, and where those things are just the same thing.
Yes, exactly.
It's going to be a lot of fun. And as a reminder to everybody, as you are gathering questions, because Megan's material is so fascinating, if you have questions, stick them into that chat, into the comments on YouTube. We're going to be doing a Q&A with both Megan and Meg at the end, so we're going to get to all of it. But please be thinking about, whatever you want to say. But thank you, Megan. That is so cool to see the real structure of how distillation works and how these ideas are getting passed from one place to another. And of course, as you pointed out, one of the ways they're getting passed from one place to another is in these amazing alchemical books, lots of which we have at the Othmer Library here. We have a fabulous collection. We have fine art, we have prints, we have rare books and manuscripts, all that stuff. So you're going to get a chance to see it right now. Why don't we roll that beautiful footage, and then we'll all come back and have a little more of a talk. We'll have another toast, and we'll answer some questions.
I love it. All right, sounds good. Let's roll it.
Donald F. Othmer of the Othmer Library had a direct interest in distillation, as we just saw a small replica of his personal still called the Othmer Still. Some of these books came directly from his personal collection. One such book is the Liber de Arte Distillandi de Compositis by Hieronymus Brunschwig. This edition was published in Strasbourg in 1512. It's a second edition in German, and the Othmer Library has two copies. One of them is hand-colored, and this is actually the copy that was donated by Donald F. Othmer himself. This text is extremely important to the history of alchemy and distillation because it's the first printed manual of distillation of medicinal waters. And while it's full of tons of fascinating evidence of practical alchemical distillation, I want to draw your attention to two material aspects about it that make it really unique and interesting. And the first is this mold for making a brick to create a furnace for distillation purposes. So this is a life-size mold. So that just emphasizes the practical ways in which people were using these texts. In addition to providing the practitioner with the correct shape and size of a brick to create a furnace for distillation purposes, in the center of this image is a banderole with a recipe for clay that can then be used to create the brick. And it's important to note that this recipe is in German, a vernacular language, and so it could have been easily accessible to an artisan who was using this text for practical purposes. The next aspect of this text that I want to draw your attention to are these composite woodcuts. And so they have a few different moving parts that are interchangeable that make up this image, including a distillation process, an astrological sign in the sky, and variations of people under the sky that are talking about the alchemical process that's going on. The image of the distillation processes that are featured in these scenes, these composite woodcut scenes, are taken from other parts of the text where they stand alone, where the various distillation processes are being described. And this tells us a lot about the production of this text, that while they're setting the type, they're also moving these images around to create these different variations within a composite image. So they're having to grab the woodcut and put it somewhere else every time that they are pressing a page. What these images are visually communicating to the reader and practitioner, and also what the little people in the images serve as, are to show that certain distillation processes are more successful under certain astrological signs. And that's why they are interchangeable and why somebody took this very labor-intensive time to set these composite images up in the way that they did. Here we have another book on distillation by Brunschwig, published in Strasbourg again, just 7 years after the text we were just looking at. And it's important and interesting to note that it contains some of the same woodcuts and engravings that were present in Liber de Arte Distillandi de Compositis. And so this means that the publisher in Strasbourg held on to these woodcuts because they either intended to use them again, knew that there would be later editions, or that Brunschwig kept the woodcuts with him and brought them back to the publisher later when he went to publish his text. As you can see, the title page image is reused in this second text. On the left page are images of a different type of distillation process that is being heated by the use of the sun. On the top image, the sun is used in conjunction with a mirror for light refraction in order to heat the distillation process, and then the lower image, just direct sunlight is heating the distillation process. And what this does is it provides a lower, more constant temperature rather than the brick furnace, which is heated by fire, and that's going to be very hot and a high temperature. Here we see again an image being reused in this text, that of the brick mold, the life-size brick mold that also includes the recipe for clay in the center. This text is also by Brunschwig. It's called The Virtuous Book of Distillation, and it is translated into English here, and it says in the title that it has also been translated into Dutch. And so the variety of vernacular languages that this text is in shows us how important it was to be accessible for practical purposes for artisans. This text has a lot of great images of distillation as well, and this particular copy is full of 16th century marginalia. The multiple vernacular editions of Brunschwig and this evidence of active readership, such as the marginalia, shows us the importance of practical knowledge for distillation. There's a particularly interesting diagram in the back of this copy of the text of a wheel that indicates the best time of year to plant different herbs for various distillation processes. And this wheel is also symbolic of the macrocosm of the universe, in that the outermost circle are the zodiac signs symbolizing the heavens, and the second outermost circle are the months of the year, followed by the seasons, and then finally the innermost circle are the 4 elements. The next text that I'd like to show you is also by Hieronymus Braunschweig, and this one's in German, and it was published in Strasbourg like his other German texts in 1531. And this is considered an abridged edition of his earlier text on distillation. And while it's shortened, it still contains some of the telltale aspects of a Braunschweig distillation book, such as registers in the beginning to organize the information. What's really interesting about the German Braunschweig texts that are published in Strasbourg, such as this one, and even though it's an abridged version of his distillation book, it contains the same woodcuts, not replicas, not copies of them, but the exact same woodcuts that we see in previous editions of this book that are published in Strasbourg. And so here you can see the same images of distillation processes being printed again and again over the course of 30 years. This text is actually mostly herbals. So his earlier distillation books that are much larger have 2 components, which are the alchemical distillation processes and then herbals in the back. What type of herbs are best used in different distillation processes? And that's what this book is mostly made up of. And these woodcuts, these images of flowers and herbs, also travel with this text through its various editions. Now we're going to move on to 2 texts that are based off of Braunschweig's books on distillation, but they are edited by someone else named Walther Hermann Riff. And these are published in Frankfurt, one in 1545 and one in 1597. What we just saw was a small abridged version of Braunschweig's distillation book, and now we're looking at an edited volume of Braunschweig called the New Big Book of Distillation. So this book edited and compiled all the most important aspects of Braunschweig's distillation books for a new audience later. And both of these texts, while they're 2 different texts and they're published over 50 years apart, have very similar first pages, as you can see here. And that's not the only similar thing about them. Both of these the text. And again, what this indicates is that either the publisher in Frankfurt held on to these woodcuts for over 50 years in anticipation of a second edition, or that the author Riff carried these around with him, knowing and hoping that he would publish a second edition of this text. While these woodcuts between these 2 texts are the same images, they're not laid out in the text in the same way. And so here are 2 of the exact same images of light refraction heating up a distillation process with the sun, and they're not in the same place in the text, as you can see. What I personally really enjoy about the images included in the Riff texts is the juxtaposition between the naturalism that you can see in some of the background aspects of these images, like the grass or this basket that holds the alembic, and how he really visually breaks down the distillation process into abstract geometric shapes. It's almost as if he's trying to mathematize the process of distillation. Finally, Riff includes the herbals in the back of his edited edition, just as Braunschweig did in his own texts. And here again, we have these shared woodcuts, so we see the same image twice in both editions. One of these images is hand-colored, and this is the copy that was also donated to the library by Donald F. Othmer. So both hand-colored copies of Braunschweig's distillation books were owned and donated by Othmer to the library. I'd like to move on from the different editions and translations of Braunschweig to talk about some other alchemical texts on distillation in the Othmer Library collections. This one is titled Alchemia, with a preface written by Peter Kernstemacher, published in Frankfurt in 1570. The first part of this text is almost exclusively images, and these images are the exact same engravings from the Riff editions of Brunswick. This text was published in between Riff's 2 editions of Brunswick's distillation texts, and they were all published in Frankfurt. And so this leads me to believe that it was actually the Frankfurt publisher who held on to these engravings of distillation processes and reused them whenever they printed a book on distillation. The next distillation text from the Alchemical Library collection that I would like to show is Del Elixir Vitae, published in Naples in 1624. What I like about this book is that it's almost playful. Here on the frontispiece, you can see some putti playing with alembics and other distillation apparatus. This text is dedicated to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinando II, who must have had some investment and personal interest in distillation. Here's another fun image of alchemical distillation, where distillation objects are not just the subject of the main image in the center, but they also are incorporated into the decorative border. These images of distillation accompany the text, and they are also composite images, like the ones that we saw earlier in the Brunswick texts. So the playful borders, the image of distillation processes in the center, as well as an engraved plate at the bottom, can all be substituted out to create different composite images. Some of these images include letters to denote different parts of the distillation process that correspond to the legend at the bottom. So it's very clear that although there are a lot of decorative aspects to these images, that the purpose of them was practical alchemical distillation. I would also argue that these composite images are in a particular order that was intended to be the order for successful distillation. And this is described in the banderole above the distillation processes in the images. The copy of Del Elixir Vitae held by the Alchemical Library has a really interesting publication anomaly, probably unintentional, where the printer forgot to include the legend, the engraved legend, under this composite image here. And when compared to a copy held by the Getty that's digitized, that we printed out an image from, you can see that the Getty has the more complete copy of this text. The Alchemical Library holds 2 copies of Distillatoria Curiosa, a Latin edition and an English edition. One's published in Berlin and the other in London, 3 years apart, 1674 and 1677, with the English edition being published second. The English edition of this text has a subtitle that reads, "The Art of Distilling Colored Liquors, Spirits, Oils, etc." So this text is very appropriate for our happy hour this evening. The English edition of this text found the frontispiece to the Latin edition so important that it was hand copied and engraved by popular London alchemical engraver Thomas Cross. Finally, this evening, I would like to look at some hand-drawn marginalia of images of distillation processes. This text, Theatrum Chemicum, is the 6th and final volume in a series of hand-pressed alchemical compendia printed over the course of the first half of the 17th century in Strasbourg. This copy contains a drawing of an alembic and a brick furnace. The final text that we'll look at tonight is one of the 2 copies of The Last Will and Testament of Basil Valentine, the English edition, published in London, 1671, held at the Alchemical Library. As you can see, this copy of the text is filled with marginalia and images of alchemical distillation, almost as if an owner was bringing this book with them into the laboratory. On the first page of the preface, an owner has written their name, Isaac Stevens, his book, 1702. With that date and the date that this book was published, it is possible that this was the owner that was heavily annotating this text. In addition to images of the alchemical distillation process, an owner has heavily cross-referenced this text with itself and other alchemical texts, which is part and parcel to alchemical active reading practices. The owner has filled any available space outside of the printed words on the page with their own interpretations of the alchemical process, both in practical language and metaphorical, esoteric alchemical language. This text is a great example of material evidence of readers using alchemical text for practical distillation purposes.
Right.
I find the books very relaxing.
I know. I'm just so soothed by them. I really am.
I have to jump in and steal the first question, which is,
yes.
Meg, is there a favorite piece of marginalia? I mean, favorite, strangest, etc. piece of sort of marginalia or adaptation that you've seen in one of these texts?
Yeah, actually, that's how I got interested in the text that I wrote my dissertation on, Fasciculus Chemicus, is my first trip to a reading room to look at alchemical texts as a student. And I came across a copy of Fasciculus Chemicus, and in the back, someone had drawn a man astride a giant goose from two different angles. And I've been trying to figure out that relationship of that image to the text ever since. So, always lots of fun doodles in these.
The alchemical goose, of course.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is yes.
There is a goose of Hermogenes, which I was trying to trace that thread, but I haven't found anything concrete yet.
All right. I like that. So I'm gonna steal a question, but I'm gonna ask one from the audience because
there are rules
care about them. There are rules, Lisa. Now. So Bonnie H asked, this is for Megan, is a glass pot better than an enameled or stainless steel pot? And I was wondering, when I was watching the video and playing around with editing and whatnot, I was thinking that to myself, can I make this in my house with just my pots, or do I need to get something special and fancy?
Yeah, this is a great question, but this is yes, the short answer is yes, you can make it with whatever pots you have. So this is the pot that I used, and it's glass. And the reason that I used it is I actually did this first with a metal pot, but if you do it with a metal pot, it's impossible to see. If you have a glass lid, you can sort of zoom in from above, but if you want to see from the side, you have to use a glass pot. If you do professional distilling of any sort, most of the equipment nowadays is stainless steel.
Okay.
So if you just go on eBay and search home distill kits, and they're all stainless steel, usually with copper tubing. And if you look at images of large scale distillation, whether it's companies that produce rosewater or even distilling alcohol, almost all of the equipment is metal. It's not glass. But the whole point of the video was so that everyone could see the process, and so that's why I used a glass pot. There are some glass stills available that you can get. But outside of a chemistry lab, they're not really that popular.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
It's almost all stainless steel nowadays.
Okay, good to know. I feel like I can achieve that. So let's see. We've got other questions here. I also want to give a shout out to Joe in the chat, who pointed out that Eric Satie wrote about alchemy in his diaries. So that's, if you heard the background music in the beginning of the books video, that's who that was. And I did not know that. I don't know. Lisa, did you know that?
I secretly did know that. So I just, to Joe,
Yes.
great. You found the Easter egg.
Yes. You win. So let's see. Another question. This is, let's see. Should we take one for, oh man, there's so many. Okay. All right. So let's see. All right. So this one is also for Megan. This is when did Roger Bacon and the other specialists realize that rosewater was medicinal? Oh, that's a good one.
It is. And I would have to, so rosewater has been used in, so medicinal, rosewater is used in cosmetics for thousands of years. And so it can be, if you want to classify medicinal as in smelling nice and not, driving away your neighbors when you go out down the street, it's been, thousands of years. But in the sense that we would think of medicinal today, let's see, there's evidence that it was used by, at least in the 10th century, 11th century, in Arabic medical texts, which is where Bacon is probably one of the places where Bacon is getting this idea. But at this point, it's just become, by the Middle Ages, it's just become such a popular idea that it's impossible to pinpoint one place and say, well, this is where they're getting it from.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, the history of using rosewater as a distillate goes back a long time.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And it is, I think this is what's actually really fun, I think, for us, is getting this opportunity to hear all the answers to these questions, and steal a couple for ourselves. So Lisa, I'm going to give you the opportunity to steal a space for a question if you want it. I'm going to break the rules for you.
See, I'm looking at that. I'm looking at a follow-up question from A. Allen about the color of the plant. I'd really like to actually, I'm going to use, since I stole at the very beginning, I'm going to use my slot for the good of all.
Okay. All right.
and
that's fair.
I'm really interested in this question, actually, how the color of the plant can influence or is believed to influence the effectiveness of the medicine, and how that might relate to rosewater and some of the other substances that we're looking at. I don't know if everyone can everyone see this question?
Let's see. I don't know if I can. Let's see if I can bring it up if I have the power.
I believe in you, Alexis.
I know. I believe in me too. It's not, you know what? Go ahead and answer it. And if I can get the technology to cooperate.
The question, I mean, I'll just read the question aloud. Many herbalists believe that the color of the plant influences the effectiveness of the medicine, or somehow the potency. There we go. Is this true for rosewater? And what is this color potency connection maybe in herbal distilling?
Yeah, so actually, in terms of rosewater, in at least for the people that I work on, I have not seen any description of different types of rosewater. So there's no, at least, well, if there is an idea that the different colors of rose petals have an effectiveness on the medicine, it isn't discussed, at least not with the people that I work on. Maybe it is elsewhere, I don't know. But like I say, there are so many people who write about the benefits of rosewater, it would be impossible for me to go through all of them. But I can tell you that if you do distill rosewater, now I said at the beginning that most commercial rosewater that's available, and actually I have a bottle here, most commercial rosewater that's available is what we think of as the standard rose scent, is made using either pink or red roses, and that's because different types of roses have different compounds in them that influence their scent and their taste as well as their color. So if you take something like orange roses, they tend to smell, they have a more I don't want to say spicy, but they have a different scent, different flavor. White roses and yellow roses tend to smell citrusy when they're distilled. Yeah.
Okay.
So they smell kind of like lavender and lemon. So yeah, you can
like that.
definitely get.
I'm gonna go get some orange roses.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah. There's actually been a whole study out of the University of Vermont Department of Plant Science on the color of roses, the chemical compounds they contain, and how this corresponds to how they smell and they taste. So yeah, there's a lot of, if you're interested in how rose color influences rose smell, there's information out there on that. Yeah, but I haven't found anything in the sources that say, you know, we have been using this type of rose or that type of rose.
I'm always fascinated by what these texts leave in and what they leave out. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that they would offer instructions for this and not really talk about the color or the scent in any particular detail. But then if we look at the book, if we look at books with giving instructions on how to make that brick, here's the exact type of clay. Like here's the clay recipe that you need to make this brick. Like just the variation between what details are considered important to include and what things get left out, to me, is fascinating. And that's not a question, but either of you can feel free to take it.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about the fact that one of the texts that we have 2 copies of, the Riff texts, one of them had the herbals hand colored and the other one didn't. And I just thought, oh, like hand coloring is typically a way to just enhance your text after you buy it. But maybe there's some element of wanting to denote the correct color that you should be looking for in the hand coloring process.
Well, because color is so important to selecting, obviously, to selecting particular plants. And, you know, these are not sold colored. They're black and white or you know, simply just black ink on paper. So, yeah, that would be that's a really cool thing to think about, that maybe this hand coloring is just serving an instructional purpose.
Yeah, I didn't think about that until now. But also a lot of times these herbals are the first time people are encountering some of these plants and they don't know exactly what they look like besides this woodcut. And so the color would help them pick this out in the wild.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's funny. I think, you know, we in the moment you take for granted so much of knowledge of what you know and why you know it and what's obvious to you. And, you know, you're not making something thinking, well, in 400 years, someone's going to have some questions about this. So let me be clear. And I always find that really, really fascinating. I mean, we've read recipes where there's one called tea with eggs, which is terrible. It tastes as bad as it sounds.
It's medicinal. Anytime we read something disgusting, we just go, it's got to be medicinal.
It's got to be medicinal. And it tells you to beat the eggs for the length of time of this hymn, and it just assumes that it says to the length of time to beat the eggs is the length of time it takes you to sing this hymn leisurely, as if that means something. But
it's a very relaxed hymn. It's not a quick, gotta get this done hymn.
It's just very, just kind of, we just assume people knew.
I want to shout out to, Pamela Smith and the team at Columbia University, the Making Knowing project that's been, over the last several years, I don't know. You can always Google this. They also do great YouTube videos and instructional videos and things like that. But, we at Science History Institute have worked with that team a few times over the last few years. And I'm always really fascinated because they're all exploring, the limit of the recipe. It's all about what information is in the text and what information do we have to seek outside the text, in just, doing it. So I think it's really cool that both of you are really looking at, trying the recipes, to making the rose water, looking at the annotations in the books and the marginalia and seeing, how do people actually use these? Because we think of them now as being sort of these rarefied objects in libraries, these books, but they were used, they were beaten up, they were marked up, they were used to prop things up, I'm sure, at various points, but they're really sources of information in a whole variety of ways, not just limited to what, the writing on the pages.
Absolutely. Actually, this is why we do this. This was a question from David. Do any of these texts show practical wear and tear being used in an alchemical lab?
Great question.
Stains, obvious chemical discolorations. And I know, Meg, you spent a lot of time just like hanging out and looking at these and getting in the mix. So yeah, this was other people were curious about this too. So yeah, what have you seen? What's one that's memorable for you?
Yeah, this is a question that I think about a lot. And I actually think at the Science History Institute, we have some of the technology to tell what the chemical stains on these pages are. And that can tell us a lot more about whether they were using them in the laboratory or not. But before going to like the tech that I don't really use or know, other people work on that. If you're just like, oh, here's a stain on this text, it probably was used in the laboratory. It's hard to say because ink stains are very common and they would look really similar, and they're also corrosive. So it would look really similar to chemical splatter from an alchemical laboratory.
I know there's at least one text that was in an exhibit that we opened in 2014, Books of Secrets. And Jim Vocal, who's our rare books curator in the Othmer Library, he worked on that show. And I know there's at least one very dirty book. I just a very, very smudged, kind of smoky, sooty book in our collection. And we've always speculated that one must have seen the interior of a laboratory. It's not singed to the level that you would think it was involved in a house fire, but it's definitely it was used, very regularly around a heat source.
Yes.
So
yes.
We like to speculate. We like to speculate on that one.
We have a whole story. Maybe
yeah, we have a whole fantasy in our head about how this book was held lovingly over the fire.
Yes, just like
right next to, a little too close.
And then they backed it up. So I want to thank both of you for hanging out with us this evening, for answering questions, for actually giving us a little peek into the work that you do and the things that you are fascinated with. We appreciate it. This was really awesome.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for hosting.
Thank you for hosting.
All right, so we're gonna wave goodbye to you, and Lisa, I think we should take people out, kind of like how we do on the podcast. Actually,
I agree. Let's do it. So
All
speaking of podcasts, let's remember that Distillations is more than a podcast. It's also our multimedia magazine. And you can find our videos, our stories, and every single podcast episode, and transcripts and show notes, the whole kit and caboodle. You can find that all at distillations.org, distillations.org.
And you can also follow the Science History Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for news and updates about the podcast and, frankly, about everything else going on in our museum and library, and all the research and cool projects that people are doing like this.
There's so much. Well, and we know that we don't have to tell you, our audience, you have been amazing. Your questions are fabulous. We're so happy that you joined us tonight. And we know that we don't have to tell you that the Science History Institute remains committed to revealing the role of science in our world, into telling these cool stories, revealing these hidden histories, and bringing the amazing research of people like Meg and Megan, to you every day. So if you would, please support our efforts at sciencehistory.org/give now.
For Distillations, I'm Alexis Pedrick.
And I'm Lisa Berry Drago. Thank you so much for listening. Oops,
yes.
I mean watching.
I know, we're so used to it. Thank you for watching and for hanging out with us. We hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Cheers.
Cheers.